Um, really, really excited to be here. I think SaaSBOOMi is a community that is truly special. I mean, we work with many different international markets, and I've never seen a community like this, so supportive of each other, so very much the rising tide lifts all boats approach. So super excited to be here and be involved in this. Today's topic is going to be zeroing in on 0 to 1 within regards to expanding from India into the US market, and how do you get that initial traction and unlock the one being the first $1 million in revenue. The purpose of today's session is to give you guys a mental model and reference point to know if you are directionally correct when you come into the US. Okay. This is going to be very much a framework that we will provide that you can then take from this session and try and execute yourself. So again, I just want to caveat what we are going to be doing today typically takes 4 to 6 hours, but you can at least walk away with the right frameworks and what good looks like with this kind of stuff. There's 2 mindsets you can take to obviously coming into the US, right? A problem-led approach or the solution approach. We spend all of our time in the problem because if the market doesn't agree a problem exists, there's nothing to sell. So the solution becomes a moot point anyway. So the areas we like to cover is who owns the problem here in the US market? Sorry, is there a problem? Who owns it? Who can choose to solve it on the team? Is it urgent? And urgency is defined by the frequency or the intensity of that pain or unmet need. And then the 2 leading indicators of an early adopter when you're talking to someone: have they tried solving it unsuccessfully in the past, right? In leading indicator number 1, and leading indicator number 2, can they articulate what is preventing them from it being solved today? If they can't answer those questions, there is a higher likelihood that they're not going to be an early adopter. And we want you as the founder to be spending your time on the highest value conversations. And these are 2 questions we like to ask to help unearth that. All right, so there's some 3 key milestones you'll be going through in the US, and we're going to be focusing obviously on 1A and 1B today. First is founder-led selling, right? I don't care if you're a PLG company or a top-down company, it's still founder-led, okay? You have to go out, inspire, excite, and get those early adopters manually. There's no other way to do it in the US, especially in such a commoditized competitive space. And 2, it is your responsibility to build out the process and the recipe. Once those 2 things have been built, you are then able to add bodies and transition over what works to them. Okay. So founders, 1A and 1B, this is your job. Okay. If you hire people before the process or the recipe is built, they're going to be running around with their heads caught off, selling differently every time with wildly different customers everywhere. And then all of a sudden you're turning into a consulting company, not a product, not a scalable product company. Right. So we're going to spend our time today talking about founder-led selling, right? And then how do you define the process and recipe while you're doing that? And Saurav and I are actually working together right now in the customer discovery phase. We're in the midst of chatting with customers to date, but I wanted Saurav to be a part of this discussion because he can actively speak to the challenges, some of the misconceptions, and then where those aha moments are while going through this process. So just a quick 30-second overview of yourself.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jen. I am Saurabh, founder of Mesh. Mesh is a performance management platform for fast-growing organizations that makes it super easy for employees to manage their goals and share feedback. So this is my 3rd SaaS venture, and we started working on Mesh around a year ago. So the first 6 months, we were busy building the product. The next few months, we got some good traction and a strong product market fit in India. And then we were planning on global expansion. So I'll soon be talking about the common misconceptions that I had in my mind when I decided to go after the US market, and how going through the entire customer development activity with Jen helped figure out how some of those assumptions were wrong and get on the right path.
So why we launched our model before we go into the misconceptions, what we're actually seeing. This is actually a jellyfish stat, so it's kind of ironic, but 91% of early stage sales is counterintuitive, right? What we mean by that is what you think you need to be doing when you come into the US is usually the exact opposite of what actually needs to happen. Some of those counterintuitive examples is going ahead and leading with marketing, letting marketing drive a lot of this activity. Well, what's going to work with your marketing efforts when nothing's been validated yet? All the way through to writing a super formal email to try and inspire folks to take a call with you. What we've learned is the more formal your email, the lower the conversion rate, right? So are there any counterintuitive examples you can share as well from what we've been through in the US?
Yeah, definitely. The first one which you mentioned that happened with us as well. Ours is more of an enterprise software with an ACV of roughly around 25 to 50,000 ACV. So we decided that branding is very important, especially when you're trying to get enterprise sales out. How do you do branding? You start burning money on LinkedIn ads. But to establish your brand, you need to first understand the problem of your target audience, the problem of your target customer, and start phrasing how you are going to solve that problem instead of going in blind and saying, oh, you're building Mesh, which is the best performance management platform out there. So that was one of the early mistakes we did that you already mentioned, Jen. The second one where we went slightly off track was we talked with a few fast growth companies early on during Y Combinator days, and we assumed that that sample set was indicative of the entire US market. We assume that all of these companies, once they hit 50 to 100 employees, they need a performance management platform in-house. They need something for managing their OKRs, their goals, running performance reviews. And it seemed a no-brainer. But I was surprised once we started doing more listening sessions along with Jen to hear that even companies which have 800 employees, which have grown like from 300 to 800 within a year, they also still don't have a performance management system. And they're looking for someone. And slowly we started realizing that 50% of the market hasn't yet signed up on any performance management platform, and it's still very, very open. So I'll talk more about my ICP and the other things later on.
And then the big reason why we launched the Jellyfish model, 93% of international startups expanding into the US market never find traction, right? Which is a wild stat. These are companies that have raised significant amounts of money. I'm not talking like Series A companies, these are B, C, D, never find traction here. Why? Because the traditional way of expanding into the US no longer works, right? And those traditional paths are typically the founder comes over and tries to navigate the US market themselves, right? With limited to no commercial experience, let alone limited to no commercial experience in the US. And the size of rounds these days, speed is everything, right? So you don't have time to spend 2 or 3 years trying to figure this out. 2, you delegate this to a non-founder. Our fundamental belief and thesis at Jellyfish is if a founder cannot sell it, there is zero chance a non-founder is going to be able to figure it out. And then third, I hear this a lot. Oh, we're going to work with the Deloittes or the Microsofts of the world, and their sales team's going to sell this for us. The news flash and the fact here is, if you haven't figured out how to sell this yet, don't expect someone's sales force to figure this out for you when they have competing priorities to sell, and you're one of the thousands of startups in their channel partnership network that they can bring to the table, right? Those sales folks are going to want to bring somewhat mature products that they know work. So if you have no referenceability, no case studies, that is going to be a colossal waste of time and effort. And if it worked, everyone would be doing that, right? And the advice too about how to expand into the US no longer is accurate or going to lead to high success rates. Do not go out and hire a US general manager. Do not go and get an office in New York City, San Francisco, or today where everyone asks me, should they be going to Miami? And don't ship a founder over here for 1 to 2 years, right? The only thing you need to focus on about US expansion from day one, okay, is can you validate that the target market agrees a problem exists? That means gives a head nod that there is a problem, and can articulate the frequency or the intensity of that, which is obviously what urgency is. Okay, that is the only thing you need to do from day one. And guess what? You guys can accomplish this from India, right? Which I don't think before was able to have been done. Right. So people want to get on Zoom calls. I'm telling you right now, most people do not want to meet face-to-face, especially at buyers at the top of funnel, right? Face-to-face is starting to become more of a sacred act once things are in positive proposal, right? So when you're out there validating, you can be doing this from India, right? And you do not have to be spending significant amount of money or resourcing to try and figure this out with bodies. So what you're looking for is a head nod. That's it. Do they agree a problem exists? And that's why we built Jellyfish, right? To act as a commercial co-pilot for founders here in the US market. All right, so let's jump into let's start getting into the meat of this. Common founder missteps. And these all will parlay into why we're going to be going into the deep dive and where we're going to be spending most of our time today. For the love of God, please do not hire people and throw bodies at it. You must define and build the process before you hire anyone. Okay. Validating if it's repeatable and reproducible, right? That recipe is critical before hiring anyone. I will tell you time and time again, the reason why people don't find traction is because they're throwing bodies at it and the recipe has never been defined. More importantly, how are you going to hold people accountable and know if this person's even good? The scary thing is 9 out of 10 people that you hire in the US market can't punch their way out of a paper bag. So you need to know immediately if you have a good salesperson on your hand. And that's why it's critical to understand the accountability and how to do this before you hire anybody's. All of the advice we're going through today doesn't matter if you're targeting the SMB, the mid-market, or the enterprise. It's going to be the exact same process you're going to follow. They would like to meet after positive proposal. Buyers are not going to give you an hour of their time anymore in person. It's just not happening. We're in the market now and people are working from home still. I think in-person meetings are going to be something that happens at the tail end of the funnel, not the beginning, right? And guess what? If you have a meeting with Walmart and you're in positive proposal, well, then it's worth you getting on a flight and coming here into the US, right? But until then, you don't need to be here and trying to get meetings in person.
Between $50,000 to $100,000, thanks to COVID, now people are comfortable signing it even over a Zoom call. Once it enters a 6-figure, then according to me, what Jen is saying, that is much needed, but we have closed between $50,000 to $100,000 just over a Zoom call as well. So it's feasible.
To give also a frame of reference point, we've moved into like the stage 2 of selling for half of our customers. We have never visited anyone in person to get these deals over the line. So with this, whether you're day one as a PLG or a large selling a $100 solution to a $100,000 solution, it's the same process, right? You're going to have to do this manually. You're going to have to go out manually and you're going to have to take this type of framework with you. So this is relevant for anyone on that spectrum doing this. And I'm pretty sure that's advice that they give at YC too, right? Manually go out, do the things that are manual first, right? Until you can figure it out. And then once you have the science and the validation, then you can begin to scale. Alrighty. Day one. I hear this from founders all of the time. Well, we are a horizontal company. You are not a horizontal company on day one. Okay. Horizontal companies happen organically as you begin to mature and expand into different markets. You have to be vertical focused first, right? It's focused on a very specific niche, right? And selling to a very specific use case. So our belief is selling to one is greater than selling to everyone at first and having that mindset, right? So going narrow and deep, and we're going to show you how to do this, is what builds trust in this market. All right. And specificity, being specific, is what's going to inspire someone to take a call with you, right? If I said to this audience, oh, hey, we solve sales challenges, you're going to begin to go, what kind of sales challenges, at what stage, what maturity, what type of companies do you work with, right? So you got to be very specific in terms of what you are doing and who you're going after. This one comes up a lot. Number 3, there's 4 misconceptions. The third one, relying on warm intros from investors or friends. While they are nice, okay, they can also tend to lead to false positives. Someone taking a call on someone else's behalf is going to be nice to you. And they're also taking that call and they might not really be feeling the pain. You want to go out and secure meetings cold for 2 reasons. Leading indicator of a sales qualified lead. If someone is willing to give you 45 minutes of their time cold, there's something there to dig into. 2, this is the process you want to start building and tracking to unlock what the recipe is and what this will look like for a non-founder. So you want to begin to understand your conversion rates as well as the founder. So sourcing cold meetings, while it is more work and takes more time, it will allow you to speed up and really get to the real revenue, right? You don't want these onesie, twosie friends coming on and then churning after a year. Okay. You really want to get people who feel the pain, and then you can begin to unlock where things become reproducible based off that specific group you're selling to. And then the last one, assuming the US will be an extension of your local GTM. I hate to say it, no one in the US market cares what you've done in Europe, in India, in Australia. All they care about is any of their peers in the US using you. And can they speak in reference to those folks? If you have a validated and you have product market fit in your local market, that is zero indication that you have product market fit in the US. Even if you're working with a US subsidiary based in that local market, it doesn't carry the same weight, because I guarantee you 99 times out of 100, that US based company, right, where their offices are based in the US, have a different process, different technical maturity, different buying sensitivities, and different cultural nuances. Okay, take a day one approach when you come into the US. Assume nothing is validated and that whatever you've been doing in your local market, you can use as constraints, but do not take it as gospel. It is still an assumption. I like to use the word alternative versus competitor, because in some cases you will have a direct competitor, right? Mesh has some direct competitors in the US market. However, alternatives mean that they're doing it manually, and that's status quo. Right? So take the approach of an alternative, right? So in 99 times out of 100, you will have direct competitors in the space. But believe it or not, not everyone is working with a direct competitor. They're doing things manually. They have a body managing it, right? So you do not need to spend time doing a competitive audit, because in your one-on-one conversations that we will show you how to get, you will begin to validate what is an overserved or an underserved need here. All right. Like with Saurabh right now in our conversations, we're understanding while the primary job might be overserved, there's a lot of secondary jobs that are not being serviced that now they can sell against and win and convince people to switch.
Sorry, I would add to it. I'll rather overemphasize if you have a competitor already in US or an alternative in US. You need to go ahead and do customer discovery even more religiously, because what you see about that company from the outside might be completely different in terms of what their customers are perceiving in terms of the problem they are solving. We thought one of the companies in US is our largest competitor, while when we were talking with another customer, she's looking for an additional solution while continuing to use a competitor which competes with us. Which can solve the problems in the ML and the analytics space for the data for them. So that, as in, companies might be ready to go ahead and position you as a supplementary product to it, rather than just replacing your competitor. So these conversations are very, very important. It will help you position your product better. It will help you define what you need to work on first and what will be the differentiator as well going forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And that when you're entering a competitive market, to Saurabh's point, that secondary job to be done, right? While the unmet need in one case might be invalidated because they already have a solution serving it, there might be 2 or 3 other unmet needs that are not solving for that they're willing to plug in another solution or battle switching costs to convert. Right? So do spend the time. And that's why we're going to go into all of this, why assumption design is so critical. Okay. So last thing before we get into the deep dive, the most frequently asked questions I get speaking to, founders every day accumulate to this list. The left-hand side is market validation. What are the questions I need to answer to validate the market? The green side is process validation. When we're speaking to investors, they love over-indexing on the process side because that is a leading indicator to help them run the math, right? So it's really important, if you're going to use this information to go raise money, to have a lot of the process stuff defined and validated. But before you even do any process design, you have to validate your market. Okay. So I'm sure a lot of these bullets probably pop out to folks. I usually pause in my conversation. I say, like, what are the 2 or 3 bullets that seem to be sticking out to you? Almost 100% of the time, it's the same 3. Who is my specific market I want to go after in the US? What is the specific pain they are feeling right now? And then what is the intensity and the frequency around that pain? Because I want to create or unearth a sense of urgency. And then that other piece is, how do I get in front of these executives in a repeatable and sustainable way? So our deep dive today is going to help you answer these questions and figure out how you can go ahead and start doing this tonight, tomorrow. Okay. So the approach we're going to take you is we're going to bring a scientific approach to early stage sales. Okay. While the art is important in terms of how you differentiate, in terms of the unique insights, in terms of just the messaging you're using, the science is critical because that's what makes things reproducible. Okay. You absolutely want the founder defining the recipe. Imagine if someone is working on some, a COVID vaccine and you don't have the main person doing it. You have the one step removed trying to figure this out. It's a pretty scary place to be, right? So you as the founder, you need to define the recipe. You can always add someone to refine it, but this has to come from you. Okay, you want to keep those feedback loops as tight as possible in market. What you hear from the market, only you are the one that can change and shift approaches. Don't expect a VP of sales to do this. They're on the hook to close revenue and hire bodies. Okay, and then they're going to be the ones that make all the excuses as to why they can't do this. Okay, so please, 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 founders, define this recipe. All right, so there's 3 criteria we're going to go through to help you figure this stuff out. How do you define an ICP? Okay. How do you develop assumptions to go out and test? And then how do you design questions to test or validate those assumptions? Okay. This is the scientific approach, again, to early stage sales. So finding the right folks to talk to. Point 1, whom do you want to get in the room with and learn from when you come into the US market? And you want to make sure you're learning from the right people. Because if you're learning from folks that are more laggards, okay, you're going to be all over the place from a directional perspective. So we're going to focus in on step 1. How do I narrowly define and build an ICP? And why that's important. Okay. Look how big the SMB space is here in the US market. 6 million companies. 16,000 companies in the mid-market, and then 2,000 companies here in the enterprise. You really need to slice and dice. Otherwise, if you're going out selling to this large of a market, God bless you. And why it's important to define before we go into this. Consistency, speaking to a very concise group of folks, asking similar questions, leveraging the same assumptions, allow you to unlock what themes become repeatable. The more specific you can get, the easier it is to excite folks. Saurabh knows right now his conversion rates are off the charts in the outreach we are doing because the specific things he is saying is inspiring the market and not scaring them off and not letting them bucket themselves into, oh, this isn't me, or this maybe is me. It's the approach he's taking is working. And then lastly, referenceability. Peers help each other, right? When we supported a founder in India, another founder in India wanted to know who we supported in India. They didn't care who we supported in the UK, right? Referenceability is the compounding effects in all of this. Okay. So here's a framework. Please feel free to take a screenshot of this, folks. Okay. This is how we help our founders drill down to define their ICP. Okay. There's 8 identifiers we leverage. Okay. And we score them on a point perspective. So Saurabh, if we asked you, and we're going to use dummy data here, how many verticals do you want to go after and test? It's okay if you say 4, right? But you're going to get 3 points there, right? We're starting to introduce high risk. But then okay, go ahead.
Sorry, ours is more of a horizontal business. So you're right. It is higher in terms of the risk, and we will get around 4 or 5 plus points on that.
Yes, he's targeting multiple verticals, but where he gets specific is in the problem owner and the types of companies he wants to go after and learn from, right? I have dummy data in the next slide, so I'm not going to throw up your ICP. I don't know if who's on this call, so I wanted to protect that. But these are the 3 where people usually score the highest points. They want to go after 4 or 5 verticals. They want to talk to 4 or 5 problem owners, and all of a sudden they want to talk to 2 or 3 teams. Okay, you introduce so much risk when you're that broad. Okay, so it's okay if you go high risk on one of these, but you got to be a 1 point on one of these 3. Okay. The other areas too, what's the company size you want to go after and target? What's the specific segment? Selling to startups is radically different than selling to enterprises. Okay, so don't tell me you sell to both. What are some technology proxies we can leverage, right, to start to begin to scrape to really find people that maybe fit really well from a tech stack perspective, right? Publicly available tech companies, you can scrape for this information. HubSpot, Salesforce, JustWorks, right? You can find these organizations, Workday, not JustWorks. The more private things like Pipedrive or Namely, it's harder to scrape for this. And then additional buyer signals we can use. Did they recently go through an M&A acquisition? Did they have some security breach? Okay, these are all things that allow you to also research who might be feeling this problem that we want to go after and test. So here's an example of one we've filled out for a customer in the past. You do not sell to everyone, okay? You want to get specific. So it's okay if you want to go after multiple verticals as long as you are selling to a very specific problem owner. Any questions here? One other thing to add is we want folks to total around 20. 20 is the sweet spot. It's a lower risk ICP. As soon as you get over that, you're going to start to introduce a lot more noise as we begin to go out and validate. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe did someone have a chance to do this for themselves yet?
Yeah.
Anyone want to share their points? Yep. As long as you're specific on the problem owner. However, the only thing I will say, right, is the technical maturity and the process of an SMB and the enterprise are always going to be different. So that is one mental model to keep in mind. And the tech stack they use, right? They're going to be using legacy progress, legacy tech stacks. If you're going after SMB or, fintech companies, they're going to be using, a lot more newer technology, right? Which can play a large role in terms of how you plug in. So the more complex your sales process is, right? So if it takes 6 to 9 months, right? And there's 4 or 5 people involved, you've got to find a way to increase price or unlock more value, because you're sitting in more of a graveyard right there, because all of a sudden you're going to add sales bodies, right? And the complexity and the price you're going to get there, it's not an exchange of fair value, right? So the more complex your sales cycle, right, the more you need to be charging, right? And in fact, enterprises actually pay $100,000 because they know the process you have to go through, right? Imagine if it took them 2 days to sign off, they wouldn't be signing off on $100,000.
So the standard metric out there is CAC to LTV should be 3 at least.
Yep.
And the other point which I say is that early on, it's fine. Your sales cycle will be long. You will figure out ways in terms of improving things. So don't assume that on day one, you'll be able to close your first lead in 3 months or very quickly. So your early on metrics are not indicative of where your industry will be a year or 2 years later.
Yep. And if you're in day one right now, right, and you're selling, a $15,000 solution and it's a 6 to 9 month sales cycle, that's okay, right? Because you get the case studies and you get the references and you can always increase price down the line. But if you're saying you have product market fit, which I think is what I heard, right? You need to be increasing price or unlocking value in a different way. So if you're going after a very specific vertical, right, I will go through how you can validate where you want to double down. We will go through that. These are all good questions because they're all leading us to where we're going.
Okay.
So now you've defined your ICP. Now it's important to understand, is it sustainable, right? So what we usually like to do is work with founders to scrape how many people fall into the category we have just defined. The mental model we use is there should be at least 1,200 contacts available you can go after. Okay. You should strive for around a 10% response rate in the beginning, and you should have about a 5% positive response rate, meaning you're getting these folks on a call. Okay. So this is just a mental model on the available contacts you want to have once you scrape this. So if there's 50 contacts available, probably doesn't make sense to spend the time validating that ICP because your market is just so small and there's nothing to be repeatable around that. Right. So you want to get around, 1,000 plus. We usually like to say 1,200. A response rate around 10%, even if it's positive or negative. Hey, I'm not interested in connecting. At least they responded, right? And maybe you can ask why, which we get to do as well. And then you want at least a positive response rate of 5%, meaning of the people that respond to you, 1 out of those 2 is willing to give you time. If you can't get to this point, something means it's wrong, right? And we're going to go into it's probably something with the messaging. So how do you inspire folks getting in the room with your ICP now that you've defined it? Okay, there's 3 approaches you can take. A scaled approach, which I'm not even going to go into because we haven't earned the right to scale anything yet. A personalized approach, and then a hyper-personalized approach. Hyper-personalized is what gets you the highest conversion rate. So you need to start there first. It will take time to write these notes. However, they will yield the highest value for you. Okay, so what is a hyper-personalized note? It means that the note you are sending to that individual, they believe no one else could have received that, right? You're writing a very personalized sentence. Here's why I'm reaching out to you. Here is the problem that we are solving for and we're passionate about. Are you feeling this internally? If so, would you be open to a knowledge exchange? Okay. There's nothing to sell yet. We're still in validation mode. Okay. And then personalize is, say you're reaching out to a market where you can't find much hyper research on these folks. You can maybe personalize it to their company, right? Or maybe 2 or 3 other folks in that organization could be receiving this note. It's not going to yield as much of a conversion rate, but it's better than sending, anything scaled. All right. So what does a hyper personalized note look like? Okay. Hyper personalized means the blue is about them. Okay. This is all about them. The red is about us. Okay, so this is just an example of someone I actually reached out to 2 or 3 years ago. Okay. The subject line couldn't be sent to anyone else, right? Neither could the first sentence. Okay. So see how much this is about them. This does take time and it will get easier as you go through it, but this is what gets people to respond to you. Being solution-led does not. Okay. So you want to answer one-to-one communication, right? Go research these people. Why are you reaching out to them? Why are you reaching out to them now? Why is it relevant to them now? And why should they care? These are the types of questions and the tenets you want to answer and leverage when you're crafting these notes. Do not hire a lead gen agency, an SDR, or leverage scale templated messaging at this stage. It will not work. You need to figure out what works before you go out and try and scale it. A lead gen agency is only going to kill your domain and scale maybe what works or doesn't work. All right. An SDR is going to do the exact same thing. And then the scale templated messaging is you're just going to be going to spam. The US market has really wised up to these types of approaches. So how do I understand if my messaging is working? How can we begin to isolate that and pinpoint where things become repeatable? There's 5 types of metrics we like to look at: delivery rate, open rate, reply rate, and then reply rate of open, reply rate of delivered, and then the interest rate. Okay. To the left of the green box, you have benchmarks we've defined as poor, average, or above average conversions. If your delivery rate is not greater than 70%, that means you are hitting spam. And that means your domain health is poor. So what you're going to need to do is create an entirely different domain and warm that up. Okay. 1 out of 3 founders we support, we have to do that exercise with them because they've positioned this and sent this out to a lead gen agency. And all of a sudden now their domain health is completely killed with this type of work. Open rates. Open rates are a leading indicator. Your subject line and the first sentence in the preview is working. If your open rates are low, that means the subject line or your first sentence is not resonating. So you now know exactly where to fix. Reply rates. Reply rates mean that the messaging you sent is compelling enough for them to respond, whether positive or negatively. It's a great place to be. Okay. If they're opening and they're not replying, that means your body copies probably need some tweaking and work. And then reply rates, right? Reply rates are, hey, thank you. Now is not the right time. That's okay, right? When we're doing outreach, timing is a big component of this. And then interested rates mean that you are able to inspire someone to take a call with you, right? That means you've hit the nail on the head. Now, reply rates, whether it be positive or negative, even if they say now is not the right time, ask them why. you want to respect it. It's totally fine. You don't want to have a call, but can you help me understand why you may not be prioritizing this? Did you just implement a solution? Is it not a high enough priority? Okay. These are all leading indicators of the top of funnel and where you can course correct. So if I don't mean to throw you on the spot, these numbers are not far off from where he is. This is dummy data. Again, I want to protect their, the work with them, but they are not far off from these numbers. Okay. So now it comes down to when you're running these campaigns, how can you begin to isolate further what's working and not? The first week when we do this level of detail and data, okay, we're looking at the top 3 verticals, right? If you have 2 or 3 verticals you want to go after. If you have 1 vertical you want to have to go after, maybe we're now using seniority as function, seniority or the people owner as that first layer, right? So wherever you have the highest points, this is when you're spending the most time, whether it be vertical, problem owner, or maybe companies. Okay, so just for this example, we're saying vertical. Okay, so the top 3 verticals, where can we double down? Once we know the vertical that is winning, we're now going to go deeper into the problem owner. Maybe there's 2 or 3 problem owners here that we want to test. Okay, so now we know the vertical, specific vertical we've isolated and want to continue to deep dive into. Now we know in the second stage, the title that is most responsive to it. The last segment, we're going to want to double down there. Okay. Look at where these conversion rates are once you've been able to identify the pulse. Okay, so wherever your points are highest on your ICP, that's where you're going to spend most of your time whittling it down. Okay. So now you've been able to isolate who cares about this, right? Through this outbound efforts. Now, once you get in the room, how the heck do you test? Right? And how do you keep these conversations consistent? So it's, we usually run a 4 to 5 point touch cadence. So 4 to 5 notes. The second and the third note is where we see most of the conversion happen. So that is for the entire cadence. Correct. Because if you're selling a cloud solution to a specific segment, that's a different value proposition. That's a different unmet need maybe. And it's probably a different type of buyer than the other solutions, correct?
I would recommend stick with one of the 2 approaches early on. Again, it depends at what stage your company is, because the ACV of both the contracts are so varied that your go-to-market approach will also vary for both. And even when you're trying to validate your assumptions, it's going to be a completely different conversation, whether you're looking for a 6-figure contract or a 5-figure contract on that side. So stick with one early on. If you have already achieved one, then you start expanding into the other one. You can go ahead and stick to whichever your gut tells more or whichever gets more validation early on and get a product market fit first in one of those.
Yeah.
That's
so they should treat both as separate ICP and try to experiment with them.
Correct.
Separately.
Yep. Yeah. So cold calling, it depends. Okay. So the answer is, it depends on the market you're going after. If you're going after what we call more blue collar jobs where they're less reliant on email, right? Like think about if you're looking to sell to lawn mowing companies, right? They're probably less responsive on email. They're going to be way more responsive on the phone. If you're selling to more of like the knowledge worker or larger organizations, right? Where they're not like boots on the ground in the operation, you're going to want to leverage email or LinkedIn. And it's because that is way more easier to track than cold calling and the evidence. Hey, like either someone doesn't pick up your call or not. With email, they might respond and say, now's not a good time. And you can unearth why, right? So email and LinkedIn, 90% of the time is where we guide, and cold calling, the knowledge working market, will erode your trust in the US market. A hard stop. No one, like cold calling is not where you want to be in the US market. That is a tactic that is like 5 or 6 years old. And they're going to put that tactic in the type of organization you are. Right? Cold emailing and LinkedIn does work unless you're going after a very specific SMB market that we know doesn't leverage email. Right. And you can look them up in a phone book and call them. Yeah. Yeah. It depends on how much time you can put on this, which I recommend. I think we typically say, try and send anywhere between, if the US market is your number one focus and you're the founder leading this, you should be try and send anywhere between 8 and 12 personalized notes a day, because during that week, you should be able to convert. You should be able to get 10% to respond and hopefully 5% to convert to a call. And my recommendation, someone said cold calling, HR, L&D, talent management, LinkedIn or email. I wouldn't be cold unless you're targeting a specific segment that does not rely on email. All right. So the types of questions to ask. Okay. Now we've been able to define our ICP. How do we now understand the unmet need this specific market is facing? Okay. Asking questions like what keeps you up at night? If you had a magic wand and would you use this are garbage questions. Okay. Because they're unfocused. They will lead all over the place. And more importantly, they're future focused. You want to understand past and present. That's what people buy against. It's a lot harder to convince a CEO if they're upselling to a C-level executive as to, hey, in the future, don't we want to be able to do this? It's much easier to say, hey, right now, this is not working, right? So you want to be past and present focused. And please don't ask the question, what keeps you up at night? That will change week, daily. There's a lot of emotion in that question. All right. So what types of questions to ask? First of all, you want to define your questions that are most important to you. Meaning if nothing else, if these questions are not validated, nothing else matters. Like that's the type of questions we want to get focused on. Okay. And then once you've defined the most important things you want to spend your time on, you want to make sure that you are asking questions around the unmet need, remove the solution. Solution does not matter in this exercise because all you are trying to do on day one is understand, do they agree a problem exists? Okay. So this is just the lens at which we take to writing assumption questions. Okay. Here's a Mad Libs you can use to build an assumption question. I believe X ICP. Okay. So let's say I believe CMOs in high growth tech startups leveraging HubSpot are challenged to X, which makes it difficult for them to accomplish Y. This is how specific you want to get your assumptions, right? You want the assumptions to be yes or no, not maybe. Maybe doesn't get you anywhere. Okay, so an illustrative examples of assumptions we've tested with past customers are, I believe my ICP is challenged to reduce the voluntary turnover within their sales team. I believe that my ICT struggles to ensure all contracts meet organizational legal standards. And then I believe my ICP is challenged to isolate the root cause of software bugs in under 60 minutes. Do you see how specific those questions are regarding a problem or unmet need? Saurabh, I know we went through this exercise 3 to 4 weeks back. Anything kind of bubble up in terms of misconceptions or best practices we went through together for folks? And this is not easy to do, I know that.
So I think the biggest mistake most founders do is they always think from the solution point of view because they've already built the solution and that's what they have in mind. So they'll go ahead with the assumptions which are in terms of the negative of the utility of their assumption out there. So to explain in our scenario, we are making a platform for making goal management, OKR management, and performance reviews easy. So I can't go in with the assumption I believe that my ICP is challenged to manage their goals. That's very, very vague. That's very, very high level. It doesn't give me any input on that. How are they challenged? What is their issue on that front? So it's very important that you make it specific enough while not making it too specific that everyone says, oh, this is not even an issue and this doesn't even matter. So there's that right balance that you will have to maintain as a founder. And that's the key in terms of writing. And I would highly recommend that write these assumptions down because it will vary across different co-founders. So all three should write in terms of what do you think can make or break your company if you don't validate or invalidate that assumption in the next few months. And that's where your focus should be rather than worrying about getting the next PR article or getting the next product feature out or anything on that side.
Exactly. Because again, to Saurabh's point, if you said, I believe my ideal customer profile challenges to, what's an example of one? Is challenged to collect data. Okay. We've heard that from founders before. What kind of data? Why is it important, right? So like being specific is so critical, because if you're answering yes or no, you don't want a non-founder who you hand this over to be like, okay, so like, but what does that mean? It should be very self-explanatory within that. Okay, so imagine, take the approach of you're going to hand this over to someone someday. It should be self-explanatory and they'll be able to read it and go, okay, got it. Okay, pretend like you're not going to be able to explain this to someone else. Okay, so now that I've defined and built up my Mad Libs, how do I structure questions to ask to validate or invalidate that assumption? Right, you're going in with 3 assumptions you want to test. How do you properly test them? So there's 3 types of questioning we like to ask. Okay. First, does the customer agree a problem exists? First and foremost, if the answer is no, 2 and 3 don't matter. Okay. So these are like linear questions. So first and foremost, do we get a head nod? Great. Okay. So we know that they agree the problem exists. Can they articulate what has prevented them from achieving it? Okay. And then lastly, can they articulate also why they have not unsuccessfully solved it in the past? These are important because these are, again, leading indicators of an early adopter that we want to unearth. But more importantly, if they can't articulate 2 and 3, the problem is not urgent enough, right? Just because you can say, yes, we struggle with performance management. If I can't explain why, it's kind of a moot point, right? Because you want to get to a point of being able to do something like this. Green and red. You can't have red, green, red. Why? Well, if they agree a problem doesn't exist, but then they articulate why they haven't solved it, something's wrong with your questioning. Okay, it can only go all green or green and then red. It can never go red, green. Okay, so you want to get to a point where for every single conversation you're having, you're putting a green or red box next to each of these questions. So if the answer is green here, you're going to move to question 2. If the answer is red here, you can now move to the next assumption, right? Because that assumption is going to be invalidated. Is this making sense to folks? So this is basically how much time and how deep do you need to go on each of these assumptions to focus in and dive deeper. This will help you isolate where you should be spending your time. Okay, you want to get to a point of greens, not red, green. Okay, so just in terms of mapping this out, this is what you want it to look like. Okay. You want to be testing each of these pillars to validate or invalidate your assumption. Okay. Is this all making sense to folks? Because eventually, once you're finished with 10 or 15 discussions, you will be able to see this at a macro view and an eagle eye view. And you can present this to your investors and to your board. And you can say, this is why we're doubling down. This is dummy data. This is actually a snapshot of 4 assumptions we tested with a customer about a year ago. They had sales and marketing effort against all 4. 2 and 3 should be completely scrapped. Look where all this red is. Okay. 1 and 4 is where they should have been doubling down. Imagine if they had this insight on day 1. You want to get to a point of you're looking at greens and reds. And by the way, red is not necessarily bad. Red doesn't mean that they agree a problem exists. It means they've solved for it already. So if they've already solved for one of these unmet needs, then you know the secondary job to be done you should be spending your time on are going to be maybe assumption 4. Right? So assumption 2 and 3 doesn't mean they were off the mark. It just means in the US market from a technical maturity, they may have already solved for that. And they're not looking for another solution because the pain isn't big enough or their switching cost is too intense. So 1 and 4 could have been derivatives of that. These assumptions, you can't do this through email. You got it. This is one-on-one discussions. This is where you're asking these questions, right? That's when you're building up, bringing in your questions from your interview kit to test the assumptions, right? So you're testing the different criteria in the assumptions we've defined. So it's not like you have to point blank ask, hey, do you struggle with X? You're asking these questions to unearth if that assumption is valid or invalid. So the beauty is when you have a specific ICP, we have built our model where you can do this in 10 to 15 discussions. You might need to add a few more as there might be some outliers you speak to and you don't want to include that into the data. But I would say between 10 and 20 discussions, you should be able to easily validate or invalidate this information. And that is, you know, if you're focused on this, this is, you know, it's doable. And you'll know directionally if you're on the mark or not before you double down and add bodies and all that stuff. So you're doubling down, your ICP is getting refined in here, and then you're refining the unmet need in the one-on-one discussions. A question you can ask to unearth pricing is you can ask, hey, remove the mesh model, remove the jellyfish model. How would you solve this today? And then you can quickly kind of build a mental model on how much is it going to cost them. Or what's at risk if you don't solve for this? How much, you know, how much is it costing you to continue to do this process?
More right? Value-driven pricing, basically.
Yeah. And then the other thing too, is if you're in a very competitive space, unfortunately, you're going to have to be somewhere on point with where your competitors are pricing themselves. Right. The beauty is when you're entering a net new market or you're creating a market where there's no real competitors there yet, you can control pricing. In competitive markets, profitability gets kind of eroded away. So you will have to be somewhat tied closely to where they're charging.
I think it can go on forever. Depends on how you want to expand into what product module next. Ours is more of a platform play. So we have narrowed down our ICP. Our ICP works very well in terms of the assumptions that we are validating. It's giving us even better clarity in terms of where do we want to double down on the product front. So that becomes the key. Because whenever someone is articulating their problem and highlighting the negative implication of not achieving it, that is also giving you an insight in terms of what more value can you drive from your product by trying to cross-sell them the other pieces, which are easy to build on the product side.
And then obviously one of the things we like to do, let me just pop this out, is in order to identify the themes, right? Can you guys see, I just changed my screen. Can you see that? Okay. You can actually go in and highlight the things that are validating or invalidating the assumptions you are testing, right? So you can actually go in and transcribe your calls if you have the right to record it. And then you can start to begin to see, let me just pull up one. Let's see. Okay. A1.3. Okay. Negative. Right. And then across those conversations, you can see why that's negative. Right. So like you can leverage the raw data too, to help you tag it green or red. Okay. Because sometimes it's not when your first time doing this, it's harder to get right off the bat. But like, this is just an example of how you can leverage these calls and go in and tag these things and hand this over to your product marketing, and also identify where things become repeatable. Like out of 20 conversations, 19 people claim this was negative, right? Out of 20 conversations, 18 people said this was positive, right? So you can begin to understand where these themes happen and why. And again, this is more evidence when you're going in and raising money or speaking to investors. This is the conviction they're probably going to want to see, right? Like, why do you believe this to be true? This is the type of information that you can bring to the table. All right. And that allows you to do a deep dive into that. Let's see how many other slides we have here. Last slide. Customer discovery. It always takes longer and costs more, right? Or not customer discovery, but in general, right? With startups, right? Sales, you have to earn the right to sell, right? And I think people don't find traction here in the US market because they go out and they try and sell before they validate and they learn. The validation and the learning is actually going to accelerate getting you to $1 million. And more importantly, revenue is a lagging indicator. So you need to know if you are directionally correct, if your sales cycle is especially 6 to 9 months long. How do you know if you're even on the right track? This type of work validates that for you. All right, and that's it. I know that was dense. Again, we spend 6 to 8 hours with founders going through this, but hopefully this gives you guys a framework and an exercise you can begin to do on your own and understand the mental models of if you know you're on the right track or not, and if things are working. The only thing I will say is a .in might hit you, right? Because that could be something that a spam blocker, like certain extensions, domain extensions can actually, like I worked at a company called General Assembly. We had a .ly, which was the Libyan domain, I think at the time, or extension. And some servers and some like corporations, especially, they're very careful about certain domains that come in. So make sure that your domain, not that .in would be blocked, but like it doesn't come off as like mature. It sounds like you're localized to India. What is your price point? Like if you're talking to a user and it's $100 a month, that's okay to introduce your product if you've been able to isolate and validate the things you need to validate. When you're talking larger price points, I would absolutely not be including your solution or your demo on this call, because the demo is almost the only carrot you have in the sales process, and you do not want to give that away, right? You want to make sure that the demo, you have all of the right people around the table, because as soon as it feels like it's one person's baby, the likelihood of it getting stopped or killed actually increases, right? More importantly, you want to be able to use all of the insights in your first call. That is where you're going to collect all the information you need to have a proper demo as well, right? Who are the right players involved? What do I know they care about? How do I structure my demo to be focused on what they care about? On the second call, it's okay to introduce your solution, but you should be only spending 15 minutes on that. The first 30 minutes, if you can get 45 minutes, should be replaying back what you learned and having them dive deeper into open questions you have, right? Because the more insights and evidence you collect, the more you're going to get to that pulse. You're just showing your solution doesn't really help you in any way, right? So, especially in this type of exercise. So we are US focused. So I have absolute confidence this does work in the US. In Canada, we've done outreach in Canada, very similar model. Australia, I would imagine it's probably similar. I've never done outreach to Australia, so I don't want to like say something that I don't have confidence around. But in terms of the North American market, Canada and the US, this works.
You can do it anytime, to be very honest. A lot of times people do it at idea stage just to validate, even if there's a market for that idea. In our case, because it was more of a red ocean, we know that the performance management systems is a big global market. It is anyways needed in US. So we went ahead and built the first version of the product, got some product market fit in India, and then went after the US market. But you can also do it pre-product or after building the first version of the product. And as I said, until and unless you haven't achieved product market fit, you can do it at any point of time. So it's not that you do it once and then it ends. I'll give you a classic example. In India, most companies don't want to showcase one individual's goal to others. People are very sensitive about goal transparency. So you'll not be able to see VP sales or VP marketing goals. While in US, everyone wants full visibility about the goals that people are using within the company, because that gives them more ownership, and people have a higher tendency to go ahead and update their goals and keep everyone updated. So there's a lot of difference in terms of smaller product features which come in, but on a meta grander level, yes, we are a performance management. Even in India, we are a performance management, even in US, but the configurations and how you define the smaller features in the product, those change across the market. And this is also one of the fallacies most of the founders have. They believe that the same assumptions which worked well in one market will work very well in the other market. Product market fit, the word market changes everything. So you might have a PMF in India where you're working very well, but the moment you start targeting, let's say, US market or Canada market or any of the other ones, you will have to understand the pain points, the maturity of that market to take your product to that level. So we fall in a similar bucket. Our buyer is the HR admin, the VP people, the VP of HR, while our users are the entire organization. So let the buyer define in terms of how you portray your product. Let the buyer define what your marketing and your sales specs and things will look. You need to provide those features, but in today's generation, it's very, very important that your product is loved by the end users. If you want to get into the product-led growth eventually, or even get a strong customer love on that front, it's going to become critical that you start taking inputs from your real users in terms of what features you want to do next. So again, there's a fine balance. Sorry, I don't have a perfect answer that only listen to the buyer and not to the real user. So it's a very fine, very important balance between the two.
The other thing too is in the inverse, if you're doing a PLG motion, a lot of PLG companies eventually have to do top down, right? So while you might just be going out to listen to the users, right, and selling to those individuals, you also, I would highly recommend also learning about what buyers care about to have that inform the product in later roadmaps as well. I've seen it in two ways. I think there's two lanes you can take, and Saurav, please feel free to jump in as well. Lane one is, yes, you can go raise funding to go out and do this work. Or lane two, you do this work and now you have a lot more leverage in your conversations with fundraising. So it depends on where you are and what your run rate is and where you are from a maturity perspective. But those are typically the two angles I've seen founders come to us for, which is, I want to go out and bring this evidence to the table when I go out and raise. Because if you're able to help show the pulse and the proof behind it, that also changes the conversation. In terms of when they should do this, I know a lot of companies building for day one in the US market, right? So day one, you need to be figuring this out. If the US is going to make up 30 to 50% of your TAM eventually, you're going to want to come here as quickly as possible, probably yesterday. Unfortunately, that's the answer, right? The faster you learn this, the faster you will unearth revenue in the US. A mental model is however long it took you to do this in your local market, assume it's going to take 2 to 3x as long in the US. That's typically what we see. And a lot of founders will come to us and say, oh, we're looking to close $1 million in the next 6 months. I've yet to see any company day one close $1 million in 6 months here in the US. So just know it does take time, and don't set false expectations with your board. So Saurav, I don't know if you have anything to add in terms of how you guys have been thinking about it.
Yeah. So I'll take it from the previous question as well. I don't think raising money is important. As Jen said, once you have data in terms of that this is a pain point of your target audience and they are looking for a solution, and you fit perfectly well in terms of what you're building, that also gives you leverage to go to investors and raise money at a better valuation. So don't believe, and there are enough validations that be it Freshworks or even Browser Stack, all of them had international traction way before raising money. We raised money early on when we started. We were second-time founders. The market was friendlier to us on that one, but it is not needed. You can go ahead and you can get traction internationally first and then go ahead and raise money.
There was one question about red ocean versus blue ocean strategy. 90% of companies coming into the US are going to fall into red ocean. Right? You are going to have built something where there are direct competitors here in the US. When you have when you're in a market where you have direct competitors, there's a few things to know. One is, in most cases, the primary job to be done is probably going to be served. So it's your job to really unearth these secondary jobs to be done. So has entered a crowded market here in the US. I mean, that's no surprise. What we are doing in our conversations with customers is unearthing secondary jobs to be done in terms of also the assumptions we're validating. Okay, if he was entering a blue ocean, there were probably entirely different assumptions. So I have to correct me if I'm wrong there. You also don't get to control price as much in a red ocean strategy. You have to be somewhere in line with where your competitors are. And what you're going to be battling most is typically switching costs, right? You need to make it so easy or be 10 times better than the competitors out there to switch. Okay. Blue ocean strategy, you get to set the price, right? Because there's not that many competitors out there. The challenge is your sales cycles are going to be a lot longer and you're going to have to create budget versus take budget. Red ocean, you're taking budget. Blue ocean, you're creating budget. Much longer sales cycle. But the pro is you get to set the price. We've seen people throw Hail Marys and it worked. We've seen people be more thoughtful, and it's been invalid. Like, I don't know. So what do you think the right answer is to that? I'm going to say I don't know the right answer.
I think it will also depend on how lucky you are with your first assumption, if it gets validated soon enough. I know another founder doing super well, worth almost, they're worth in $6-figure million and have scaled significantly. I'll not disclose any of the numbers on that one. But it took them a year to kind of figure out whether their assumptions are validated or not. While for us, the first set of assumptions, we have a strong feeling we'll get the indicator on it in the 2 months itself. So it just varies from companies to companies, and the budget it will take. It depends on whether you're doing it yourself or you're engaging with someone else to go ahead and run the entire activity. So that's going to be the key thing. As founders, we tend to carry a lot of bias because it's our idea, it's our vision and our product. And so we always think that this is a pain point that the customer will have. And even when we are doing the customer discovery sessions, we'll often plant the words in the mouth of the target customer. Do you have this pain point? You might as well just go ahead and explicitly ask where the other person is like, oh, I can't say no. It's an obvious question. Yeah, I have a pain point. But the moment you start digging deeper, you ask him, have you ever searched for a solution on this on Google? Have you ever decided a budget for it? They're like, no, we never searched for it. So those things are themselves an indicator that your way of approaching and having them confess that it is a problem is wrong. And sometimes people will say they have the problem just to get rid of you. So don't plant words in your customer's mouth and run it in a more disciplined manner. And as a founder, if you can stay unbiased, that is the most critical thing. And I think Jen does a fabulous job in terms of doing that entire activity.
The Saurav said something that kind of helped me structure my thoughts a little more. When you're going through this exercise, right, it's a trade-off coming into the US market, right? The trade-off is if you raise money and you don't have the evidence, there's a cost to that. The other trade-off is if you if you raise money and then come here, there's obviously a cost to that. If you come here, if you do this exercise first and then go raise money, right, and you've been able to isolate it, you have an entirely different conversation. So to best answer that, it really depends on which trade-off you're more interested in and where you really are from a runway perspective as well. So in terms of the jellyfish model, we put about 2 bodies towards this, and we run and own the execution side of it. We scale the founder's time, right? We're putting the founder in the room with the highest valued conversations based off of research we are doing, and based off of whom we know they want to learn from and sell to. We also will join those conversations with them, because when you have us on the call, it feels like you have a US entity here, right? Even though you don't need to do that, right? We kind of play that like US role and can play into those cultural nuances. People that we typically work with have raised at a minimum, over 1.5 million in venture capital. That's typically kind of the type of organization we're working with. Anywhere between 1.5 million to about 7 million is whom we're working with. 1.5 million is earlier stage, right? They built for the US market first. 7 million, maybe they went to Australia or the UK first and are now coming to the US. It's the same process. It's the same effort. Which in terms of wherever you've raised, but we own the execution for those 3 months of customer discovery, and a lot of the work we shared with you. But we force the founder, no one else, force the founder to be involved in every external call to keep the super tight feedback loops. And as soon as it becomes a question of, yes, this is a problem, how do you solve it? That's when someone like Saurav takes over the conversation.
Jen has pretty much answered it. And it takes roughly 3 months of, you can assume, 3 people. So you can add the numbers in terms of their salaries, their expectation, and figure out how much it will cost you.
Yeah. So we are the 0 to 1 team. We will help do the customer validation and then help close the early adopting customers in the phase 2 of work. We have to first earn the right to sell. we're not the scale, like I wouldn't say we're the scaling team. We will help you define repeatability. I think repeatability and scale are two very different things. Scale is you're adding bodies to it and it's now a pure numbers game. For us, we're 0 to 1 customer validation and then helping close those early adopting customers. So like making it repeatable.
Good. So it indirectly helps you post PMF as well, because once you have gotten that defined process, where your SDR reaches out, your AE has picked up for the first call, the second call, how to go about it, you can go ahead and replicate that model for your growth as well. But as Jen said, they don't do it directly, but the learning from it is which goes forward even post PMF.
So I think the hardest thing for us continues to be probably defining the right questions, like the assumptions, because we have a very specific approach to it. And then sometimes the founders have a very strong stance on one thing and we'll say that's not specific enough. And they'll say, well, we've done this in our local market and we can't get more specific because people are going to opt themselves out. So for us, it's actually finding the right balance. Definitely takes the most time and refinement. I think if I were to say, where do we spend the most time? It's definitely in the assumption design. I mean, that's where we spent the most time with Saurabh. And then as soon as we define those assumptions, right, all of a sudden sometimes after the first call, we'll say, wait a second, those assumptions were totally off based off of just like the responses we were getting. And you don't want to have a knee-jerk reaction to changing assumptions, but sometimes it does put you on your back feet a bit to say like, are the questions you're asking correct? So for us, I think being iterative is so critical and knowing when we need to change and having the confidence to know when to do that. And sometimes that happens on the first call. Sometimes it doesn't happen to the 5th call, right? So I will be the first ones to say we are no silver bullet. This is always hard. There's never like one easy engagement. It's really hard work. I mean, so we were challenged a little bit to figure out the assumption piece, right? We were kind of going back and forth for a while. You know, it is still a lot of manual efforts. While we have defined the process to do this, you know, whom our customers want to speak to and the questions they want to ask are different every single time. And that never gets easier. Trying to brute force an answer or trying to brute force an approach that they want the market to say. Sometimes it's like we were working with a founder a couple months ago where everything we tested was invalidated. They had built something that was just completely technically like immature from where the US market was. Like we heard was like, we solved this 5 or 6 years ago. Like, we don't really have a problem with it anymore. We've like refined it enough. Like these were just some, like their technical maturity was completely misaligned in the US. And if that's the truth, you can either one, recreate a whole new product and go back to 0, or realize that the US market is not the right place for you to come and expand right now. And I think more founders need to be aware. Sometimes the US market is not the right fit for you right now. And I know that you need to prove it. And that's where most of the businesses are. But you have the option of like spending 2 or 3 years here and getting that same exact answer. The market never lies, right? You're either lying to yourself. So sometimes it is hard feedback. But like, that's why we built our model. In 90 days, we will tell you if you should not be coming here. And I would say 1 out of 10 times that is a result. What was the aha moment, if there was one? Where was it? Where were you kind of like, where did things click for you guys? I'm just curious. If you don't mind putting that in the chat or just verbalizing it, I'm very curious. Metrics. Okay. Validate the problem. Okay. This is really helpful. Saurabh, you can see this as well, right?
Yeah.
And thank you, Saurabh, for joining and being so vulnerable and open too.
Yeah, always happy to share.